very near and dear to my heart. Very excited to break open this subject with all of you tonight on spiritual emergency. Is this spiritual awakening or a mental health issue? Or maybe a bit of both? Yeah, it is a serious subject that we're looking into tonight. I want to set that serious tone into the space, but I also think there is something of levity around it, and we need to have some levity when we approach this subject of mental health, mental illness, divine madness, whatever you want to call it, that at times afflicts us all. And if you don't think it afflicts you at any time in your life, then you're probably psychotic and a chronic liar. But having said that, it is an important subject that is coming more and more out into the public domain, and this is important that we have conversation around it and try to understand it more from different angles. We know that science, Western science, is working very hard to support people in this domain and to give support and what they can within their resources. But this being the spiritual science talk, we have openness to survey other angles, including the spiritual angle of mental health, mental illness, and the things that can afflict our minds and souls at different times. And I thought I'd start off with a quote from Alice in Wonderland. Yeah, don't want to quote too many like doctors or things like that right off the bat. I thought I'd quote from Alice in Wonderland after she tumbled down the hole into Wonderland and met the Cheshire Cat up in the tree. And Alice went to the cat and said, "I think I've gone mad." And the Cheshire Cat looked at her and said, "At last! Going mad is wonderful. Eventually we all go mad. It makes life far more extraordinary. But once you go mad, hold on to it. People will try and take it from you. The unlucky who have not yet found their own madness. It isn't easy, you know, going mad." And this is true. It isn't easy. And part of the difficulty of it is because sometimes the attitudes of those that have not been lucky enough to have lost their mind at some time and then perhaps regained it, and to have a deeper understanding and wisdom of life because of having gone through that particular situation in their life. I was doing some research for this and came across an article online on the CTV network news website where in the article it defined psychosis as an illness characterized by a loss of connection to the real world. Psychosis is characterized as a loss of connection to the real world. Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, back up a second. What is the definition of real world? And maybe we better tell Alice in Wonderland, what the real world is after she tumbled down the rabbit hole. But also on another website with an article in Psychology Today, there was an interesting article called "Spiritual Emergency versus Psychosis," and this was written by a transpersonal psychologist named Diana Raab. And she started to define what spiritual emergencies were. What is considered a spiritual emergency, and gave examples of peak experiences such as spontaneous past life regressions, connection with spirit guides, Kundalini awakening, forms of possession, near-death experiences, UFO encounters, and different forms of drug and alcohol addictions. So that's sort of the short list, I think, of what she put as different examples of what is a spiritual emergency or psychosis. And she was really drawing a lot of information from this book, which I took the title of the talk from, called Spiritual Emergency, when personal transformation becomes a crisis. And this is actually a collection of essays put together by Stanislav and Christina Grof. Stanislav Grof is a MD psychiatrist, and his wife, who's passed away now, Christina, was a transpersonal psychotherapist. And I remember when this book came out in the 80s, and it hit the book stands with a lot of excitement, because there's a number of different writers well known in here, from Ram Dass, Jack Kornfield, R.D. Laing, and so forth, and also articles from Stanislav Grof and Christina Grof, taking on this subject of spiritual emergency, and trying to come to terms with this thing of psychosis and mental illness from a spiritual perspective. And I only acquired the book a couple of years ago, and have been enjoying reading it recently just to prepare for this talk. But I remember seeing it back in the 1980s, and I was interested in studying psychology at university. I began a degree in psychology, and then because of my own episodes and dealings with mental illness and mental challenges, left the institutionalized the institution of university and instead went and studied spiritual psychotherapy, which I have no regrets for having done at all. But so books like this have I found very compelling subject to bring in kind of a different camp, because there's a bit of setting up of camps in our society, and they each have their own biases. Like one doesn't want meds at all, and the other one, resorts to meds quite readily when they diagnose psychosis. And there's stigmas with both as well, like people that are into spiritual stuff that's kind of like woo-woo, and it's new agey, and it's flaky. You start talking about past life regression or Kundalini awakening. It's a bit too much for the medical establishment. Whereas the people in the spiritual camp, they as I said, they don't want meds, they don't want to get in the system and whatnot. But they both have their pros and cons, and ultimately, we want to bring the two together, because Western science definitely has a lot of resources to help and support people, and a lot of what we have from the spiritual side is from the Eastern world, the world of Taoism and Buddhism, and Ayurvedic medicine and things like that has its support. But some of the writing in this book, in Spiritual Emergency, talks about how transpersonal psychologists believe that spiritual emergency can be powerful because the experience tends to transcend the ego. It's an episode of transcendence, in a way, going beyond the confines of the ego, which can have a very heavy grip upon our inner state of being. The ego, the identification of what we are in our physical nature and makeup, and identification as our nationality, our gender, our race, our religion, our ethnicity. These can be very limiting shoeboxes. Even our blood lineage has a grip on us from the past, and it's all kind of a composite within this ego nature that we identify with. So the thing with episodes, if we can call it, it can be moments, or perhaps prolonged moments, could be weeks, even years, of transcending, breaking out of that over-identification with this ego that we have. And so these transpersonal psychologists writing in this book say that these sorts of episodes may be a natural developmental process. A natural developmental process that has psychological and spiritual elements. So what is it when something happens where we have a breakdown, a mental breakdown, a nervous breakdown, some sort of psychotic breakdown? It could be reframed in a very positive way from the perspective of spiritual emergence, that the breakdown is actually a breakthrough, that something is wanting to break through. And we know that the forces in the psyche are unrelenting to want to break through and be known. And if we're not actively accessing the unconscious, the well of being that we carry with us, then these things are going to act out. They're going to act out in their own way. They're going to come out the side door or the back door, rather than us coming through the front door and saying, here I am on earth. Thank you for opening the door and allowing me to enter onto the stage of life. Come on in. Welcome. Have a seat. Yeah. My name is Jesse. What's yours?
Megan.
Megan. Very good. Very good. Yeah, why don't we take a moment here just to do a go-round and hear people's names. And if you have a question or if you have something that you want to contribute, we won't necessarily go into it at this moment, but if you wanted to share something of your own experience, or something that you know, with yourself personally or someone that you know, you can make that known now, and we can see how we can weave that into the evening. Okay.
I'm Andrew, and when you said something about losing your mind, in my experience, it was about losing my programming.
Losing your programming. Darn. Is there a place for lost and found programming?
So you start doing things you're not familiar with, so it really challenges the ego, because the ego's job is to just keep things the way they've always been.
Yeah.
So the ego goes into total panic, and that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But the opportunity is dumping the programming.
The ego hits the panic button because it doesn't want to change. Yeah, it doesn't want the programming to change.
Well, its job is to keep everything continuing,
Yeah,
like nothing's changed.
on a too even keel.
So it thinks, I'm not doing a good job anymore. And psychiatry seems to talk to the personality, you know, like how can you have a better role in life. And one psychologist said, you're not mentally ill unless it affects your ability to earn money, which I thought was a terrific.
You're not mentally ill unless it affects your ability to earn money?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's a good benchmark.
Oh,
Are we in the Matrix or what?
So I think psychology talks to the personality rather than the soul.
yeah.
And these transpersonal psychologists, like Groff and Jung, actually deal with the soul rather than the personality.
Mm-hmm.
And the job of the personality is to get along with other people and, you know, not get violent and, you know, that kind of stuff. So it's a containing kind of force.
Right, so nice distinction. Yeah, the personality is the mask
Yeah.
that allows us to interface with the world, hopefully in a harmonious way. And then the soul is really the soul life, the inner life, what's really going on in the psyche, the archetypes, the configuration of one's makeup, and all that plays into it from the unconscious. Great, thank you.
Arrow. Yeah, I really appreciate the way that you're introducing this. I have to say, I think there was a part of me that was coming in like a, I want to say like in I just had my extra critical hat on, and I think it's because of what you said about the camps, the setting up of these camps, and I have been in many of these camps, and I have checked off a bunch of these identity boxes, and I do have interesting lenses through the chapter of my life in regards to mental health, both lived experience as well as on the clinical side of things, on the research side of things, on the counseling side of things. So I have an interesting vantage point, and I really like what you're saying about these camps, and also being someone who's on a spiritual path. I've definitely seen the debate and the argument almost of what is the best care or treatment. People that I'm in different communities that have experienced both mental health as a spiritual emergence, as well as, hey, there's something wrong with me that needs fixing. And yeah, I'm excited to see how we can connect everything together, maybe taking a step back and seeing all of the parts of this just to get a greater vantage point. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just for our people on Facebook Live, we're just doing a quick go-round with people in the loft here, just getting names and just a little idea of what they bring, questions they bring, and whatnot. So with Arrow, yeah, it was about how you've seen both sides of the coin. You've been afflicted, shall we say. It's difficult to find the right language around this, or you've been liberated through, breakthroughs, and that you feel empowered now to serve people in a role of counseling and support, which is really fantastic, I think. And for myself as well, I had to go down before I went up to be in a different place in my life to be able to support and serve more strongly. So.
And one thing, just extra, in terms of the encampment and like I stand for this or I stand for that, it's interesting the different access of community that you have with that. And like, for instance, there's a big kind of mad pride movement.
Mad pride.
Yeah, of being like, hey, this is something I experience. And then I know that when I'm in a group of people, that someone else has been like, hey, this is what I've experienced. There's solidarity.
Yes,
And there's
exactly.
community
Solidarity.
bonding.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
community. We all have to recognize we're all we're all here because we're not all there.
Yeah.
Here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah.
So there's solidarity in acknowledging that.
Yeah, and to celebrate.
And to celebrate it, that we are whole in a sense, but we're not complete in our journey to fullness. So we have to take what's given to us as wholeness. I was teaching this last night in the spiritual boot camp, that we have a seed, a spiritual seed within us that's whole, but it has to go through a journey, an evolution of growth to come into fullness. And that's why we plant the seed in the earth, so that it is exposed to the elements, earth, water, air, fire, and so forth, to cause growth within that seed. But the first thing that happens with the seed is it cracks open. The seed has to be cracked open and liberated, so the life within it can liberate and begin its journey of growth to fulfill what it can become. But we know with the plant, there's a lot of trials, there's a lot of tribulations, there's a lot of challenges for that plant to take its spiraling journey from the earth towards the light. And there can be fallout around that. Let's continue our little circle around here. And thank you for your aspiration to be able to serve others, having gone through your own experience, and now you see the fruit of that is to support all of humanity coming out. It's like we're coming out of the shell of the seed. It's a big coming out. And we need to gear our thinking into how this is the way life is going to be, you know, on the slippery slopes of the personality and the soul and the spirit and the body. And how can we get cracked without falling through the crack and getting lost?
When there's a context.
Context. Yes. That's such a huge point in all of this, that from the perspective of spiritual emergence is speaking more about context rather than the center. In Western medicine, it's always trying to deal with the center, going right to the symptom, and to get rid of the symptom, because when the symptom's gone, no one's going to be complaining, right? But that just can waylay the problem till later. So with spiritual emergence, a lot of it is about the environment and the periphery. What is the periphery that holds the center? Is it a healthy environment that holds the center so the center can grow and do its spiraling as a seed does from the earth to the sun? Everything that's growing is spiraling, but it doesn't spiral out of control, but it's held by the periphery. And this is part of the problem in modern society as it's being deconstructed and fragmented. And there is this really a natural course of separating out, as you put, cells, where there's this cell division, and we're all like cells that are dividing from the tribal group soul and individuating. And this is a necessary part of being liberated, is to be individuated and to step out from the herd, as it were, to the herd mentality. But that is the slippery slope, to be able to hold ourselves or be held in the right environment to grow and move in as healthy a way as possible, with as little carnage as possible. Yeah. I'll just pick up on that note to quote Socrates, who once said, "Our greatest blessings come to us by way of madness, provided that madness is given by the divine gift." So that kind of qualifies, there's less desirable madness and more desirable madness. And certainly there is forms of madness that are less desirable, that may take one into a dark place for a long time. That's not necessary to be in a dark place for a long time, or it may lead them to pulling the plug on their own life and choosing the route of death, which, I mean, we all are going to die sometime anyways, so it's not that we should fear death or consider death to be a bad thing, but when we do pull the plug on our own lives and miss the opportunities that life gives us to struggle through, to struggle and strive, which is why we're here, we are to strive, then that is perhaps not fully accepting the divine gift that Socrates talks about, finding the right relationship to madness. Also to honor the ancestors, the ones that were actually here, before. And this is a big point when we talk about being in solidarity with the entire community, because the entire community isn't just what you see is what you get. The entire community does include the ancestors. It does include those that are on the other side. And this is often what precipitates psychotic episodes or mental illness, is not acknowledging the presence of other beings in our lives, be they spiritual beings or the unborn or the so-called dead. And in some of the writing of Rudolf Steiner, who really puts a high premium on continuing relationship with those that have died. Because to ignore them is like ignoring your loved ones, ignoring best friends. Just because they have left their physical body doesn't mean that their presence can't be felt and that their wisdom cannot join and play into our wisdom. And in fact it does, according to Rudolf Steiner's clairvoyance. And I imagine all of you may have had experiences of this kind where in your own inner life it's affirmed to you that we can still be in relationship with those on the other side of the threshold. And Rudolf Steiner says that a lot of illness, particularly abdominal illness, and I'm not sure why he says that, but abdominal illness can come from ignoring the relationships and the connections that we have spiritually with those that we were connected with while they were on earth. And he says we are going to continue the relationship with them after we die. You know, we're heading towards the end of the conveyor belt, you know, ourselves, and going to get off sooner or later. And we might be surprised that they're there. And we are joined with them in spirit, and we're continuing to work together and possibly even preparing for another incarnation together to do work. This is, of course, the idea of you know, the transmigration of the soul, reincarnation from one life to another, which I will probably get more into in the part 2 of this talk in 3 weeks. So yeah, thank you all for the little seeds that you brought in that we can riff on. I'm going to continue a bit here from what I was getting out of this book, Spiritual Emergency, When Personal Transformation Becomes a Crisis. And how Stanislav Grof describes spiritual emergency as a crisis often resulting in intense emotions, unusual thoughts and behaviors, and perceptual changes. Well, doesn't sound too bad to me. It's like, I mean, some people go out on a Friday, Saturday night just to get that and make good money at times. And that crisis often involves a spiritual component, such as experiences of death and rebirth, a sense of unity with the universe, encounters with non-visible beings, often powerful beings that they encounter. And of course, people have these experiences when taking psychoactive substances such as ayahuasca and mushrooms and things like that. But we're talking right here really about non-usual states of mind that can afflict people spontaneously and not necessarily being looked for or welcomed. But such crises bring about potential for profound psychological and spiritual change, but often appear to be similar to psychotic disorders. So in summary, to sum up really what this book is saying, is that the primary difference between psychosis and spiritual emergency has more to do with the diagnostician and the suggested treatment more than anything else. So again, we're back to the different camps and how you want to look at it. And we have a choice. Do you want to look at it as a negative thing that necessarily needs to be fixed and treated and you know, coded over so it doesn't happen again? Or is there an opening, an opportunity there that needs to be fostered and move forward? You know, because once something's cracked open, you can't really put it back into the package, right? It's out. Once the shrink wrap is off, it's out. Don't bother like trying to put the shrink back on and take it back to the store. They don't want that. It's out, and now you have to deal with it. So let's talk a bit about maintaining balance.
It disconnected. It's
It
fine.
does that, yeah. Talk about maintaining balance, because often that's really the way that this is characterized, that it's a loss of balance and could be a loss of chemical balance, and that's often the way it's treated within the Western medical model, that we are made up of these physical things, including the chemistry of the body, and so that we need to maintain chemical balance. Well, this idea is actually not a new one, and harkens back to the early days of Western medicine in ancient Greece, and Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine. And in the Greek schools, they talked of the four humors, and the four humors were the fluids in the body, the biles in the body. There's the yellow bile and the black bile and the phlegma and the blood. And depending on how these fluids were balanced in the body determined your humor. That's where we get the term, good-humored or ill-humored, depended on how these humors, these fluids were balanced in your body. And so, that would determine your mood. And of course, your mood determines your mental state, and that determines your behavior, and to a large degree, that would determine your personality based on these four humors, which is also referred to sometimes as the temperaments, the four temperaments. And that's where we get the term, good-tempered or ill-tempered. And I've noticed that with myself too, and maybe you have. When I used to drink, and I drink alcohol, I don't anymore, but I used to drink, just moderately like everyone else, that my mood for the next day or so, I'd be ill-tempered. I'd be kind of mean-spirited from, how the fluids, the liquids, the chemistry in my body had been changed by the alcohol. And even with excessive masturbation, which is, very powerful force to unleash the forces, the liquids, the semen, and so forth in your body, can dramatically change your mood and state of being because of this change in chemistry. Would you like to comment on that?
Even for women?
Well, I'm not a woman currently. Maybe a woman would like to comment on that.
What's
But
excessive?
yeah, what's excessive masturbation? Okay, now we're really going down.
3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Well, yeah,
Well,
just say masturbation.
There is
so.
such thing as there is female ejaculation. So
Mhm.
But there is a difference between the way that men and women experience it. Women have the ability to keep on going. That's something that differs. Men, that's something where it's like that seed you don't get back.
Well,
And-
speak for yourself.
If you talk to the if you
Contrary.
talk, well, it depends on how you use it. But
Yeah.
in the Taoists, like their whole thing is if you're 21 and under, you can
Right.
masturbate every 4 days. But it's like when you get etc. When you get 30, it's like once a week. 50, it's like you shouldn't do it.
It's like,
You know, it's one of those. And in winter, you shouldn't release. It doesn't mean you can't engage intimately, but it's the ejaculative that's.
So if you're gonna masturbate, have your calendar handy. But I mean, think of it for men. Like when you do ejaculate, the liquid,
Mhm.
the semen that goes out. We're not just talking about bile. We're not talking about blood. We're not talking about saliva. We're not talking about hormones. We're talking about a substance that will produce another human being.
yeah.
And what it takes for your body to produce the semen that's going to produce another human being.
Mm-hmm.
That is like liquid gold that we really need to, value more, because it is taxing on the body, and that is going to change your chemistry. It's going to change your state of mind. Absolutely, yeah. Nutrition
What kind of
is
water,
extremely important for our mental state, because the mind-body equation is working together. If the body is not healthy, then it's hard for the mind to function in an unhealthy body. And likewise, if the mind is full of negativity and repressed emotional states and so forth, then it's going to be hard for the body to function. So we need to feed both our mind and body with good nutrition. One of the first things that's affected in the body when you have poor nutrition is the brain. The ability for the brain to work is immediately affected by the level of nutrition, which is a little bit alarming when you think of, the devitalization of the food that's taken place over the last century around the world, and certainly here in North America. It's alarming that we're eating food, but it doesn't necessarily have the vitamins and the minerals or the life force, which is really what you want from the food, and why people are turning to things like yoga and pranayamas and whatnot to sustain themselves more directly with prana through yoga. So, yeah, this whole thing I just mentioned the split that we experience in our mind and body in modern living, that, we treat the body as just something to get the mind around from point A to point B, but there's wisdom in the body. The wisdom is really the oldest of our bodies. If you think that we have a physical body and an etheric body and an astral body, and then the spirit self, the physical body is actually the oldest of the bodies, and the egoic self is the youngest in terms of the evolution, spiritual evolution of things. And so to bring the mind back to the body is key. Listen to the body. And that's why in the spiritual boot camp we learn this technique called focusing, which is a body-centered modality where you're constantly bringing your attention back to the felt sense in the physical body and being guiding your psychological process from the felt sense in the physical body. And it's very powerful, it's very wonderful, and people get tremendous shifts. I had someone here last week who had pain in his hip for years due to it was a sexual abuse issue as a child, and he was taking CBD and THC and all this to relieve the pain. One focusing session, and I just heard from him this morning, and he said, yep, pain's gone, the hip's been relieved, he can walk fine now. So the mind-body thing is really key. But we live in a paradigm, this Cartesian paradigm, which I like to talk about, the scientific paradigm that really, birthed by René Descartes, and it's referred to as the Cartesian split, because we consider mind and body separate and me and others separate. There's all this splitting through this objective science that is the predominant paradigm at this time. And you can even look on Wikipedia, it talks about Cartesian anxiety. That we all are really suffering from this low-grade Cartesian anxiety because we experience this sense of split, fragmentation, particularly in our own being, between our thoughts and the physical body that holds these thoughts. So with the work of Rudolf Steiner, he took the idea of the four temperaments and he evolved it into what he calls the four temperaments. The four humors, he referred to more as the four temperaments. And that's a model that's used in the Waldorf schools around the world. And I trained as a Waldorf school teacher and taught there for a few years and love this idea of the four temperaments. That's not looking at the four fluids in the body, but really the four bodies themselves, the physical, the etheric, the astral, and then the spirit self. And that depending on how we are configured and aligned with these four bodies, that will determine our personality, that will determine our behavior, that will determine our state of being. Because some are more in the fire, some are more in the air, some are more in the water, some are more in the earth element, with these four bodies and these four temperaments. You can look it up. There's many books out there on the four temperaments in the way that Rudolf Steiner birthed them through his work known as anthroposophy. So wanted to touch a bit on my experience and why I sit here and have a concern for this or feel I have any authority to speak on this subject at all. But it is because of something I've gone through in my own life at different peaks and valleys. The greatest peak and valley was right around the time when I turned 20, and my whole life fell apart at that time because I fell apart. And I'm probably going to speak more about this in part 2 of this talk in 3 weeks, because I'm right now just enjoying thinking about that period of my life when everything fell apart, and what was going on in my mind and my soul at that time. But the reason I fell apart, I know quite a bit about that. It was really a combination of things. Firstly, there was substance overuse. Substance overuse. What's overuse? What's excessive? Well, for me it was excessive. I was also dabbling with energy techniques at the time, which I really knew little about and didn't have any proper training. But I had quite an obsessive curiosity about working with energy, and had kind of a brazen confidence to try it out and to see what powers I had at age 20, what powers I had and what powers I might have over others. That was quite, the impulse behind the curiosity to see what kind of powers one can have over another. So I also had a situation where some relationships turned bad, and then culminated in psychic attacks upon myself that also led to the collapse. And at the time I was at university, I was studying at university, and my mind was just being filled with a lot of disjointed information in a very rushed and unhygienic way. You know what it's like, those of you who've been to university college, where you have to consume and then regurgitate information and not necessarily integrate it. And knowledge is we're meant to build ourselves with knowledge. We're really meant to take in ideas and make them ideals. Not just to take them in and then regurgitate them on an exam so we get the piece of paper at the end of our degree. So that's what I mean by unhygienic. And this is ubiquitous in our society, that we're not really handling information in a hygienic way. Knowledge and experience really needs to be reflected upon in an objective way so it can be integrated and used to build ourselves. We're here to build ourselves, right? That seed that's meant to grow into fullness has to be built out of material. And the substance of that material is knowledge and experience when it is handled the right way. And at the time, my spiritual needs were not being met. I didn't really have any spiritual guidance from any quarter, so I was on very shaky foundation. I had lots of ideas in my head, but no one to guide me in my budding spiritual awakening. So I fell into illusion, I fell into error, I fell into fear, I fell into terror. And this lasted for quite some time, where I suffered severely from panic attacks, and then finally into isolation in my parents' basement. That became kind of the hideaway, but over time it became also the prison that I eventually had to find a way to get emancipated from. I did ask for help. My parents really didn't comprehend what was going on, but I did begin reaching out for help, and they took me to a psychiatrist, and after some discussion there, I realized this was really not the route that I wanted to go. I didn't feel the chemistry there, so after that I went to a barrage of healers and psychics and mediums and herbalists, trying to recover from a complete collapse of my personality. So I was a bit like Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's kind of the way I was. I was like an egg flattened on the floor. But it brings me to this question: why does spiritual awakening for so many initially take us in a seemingly wrong direction? Right? We feel this burgeoning from within, this awakening from within. And all we want, is love and peace and joy and harmony. But I don't know what your experience was. So maybe, then you become angry. Instead, you become angry at the world. You become angry at everything for the way it is. Even though it's always been like that and continues to be like that, you're having this spiritual awakening. All of a sudden, you're angry all the time at everything in the world. And not only that, you become frustrated. You become frustrated with others because they don't see things your way, right? And they won't become the way you want them to become. So you're just frustrated and angry all the time. And then you become upset at yourself, right? For almost everything. You're just upset at yourself, except for the fact that you actually feel very special inside. Like you're all upset at everything, but there's a sense of specialness inside because deep down you're destined for greatness, right? But it's overlaid with this upsetness that's there, and of course you're jealous and envious of everyone else because in your illusion you think everybody's got it better, right? So you're envious of what they've got, and yet you ignore the fact that this is actually coming from a place of arrogance in yourself because of the above said specialness that you feel inside and how you're sure you're destined for greatness eventually. And then, last but not least, you're miserable with every bite of food. Everything you put in your mouth, there's something wrong with it, right? So it's like, oh, this isn't right. This has got sugar in it, and this isn't organic, and the world's terrible. So you grumble with every bite. And instead of finding gratitude, you can't find gratitude for anything. So eventually, we have to put a mask on, right, to cover up all this stuff going on inside. We're trying to have a spiritual awakening, but all of a sudden we're just totally messed up. We have to put a mask on inside in order to fit in and survive with society, right? Or risk the crippling effects of isolation and loneliness. We don't want to be lonely, right? So we've got to put on this mask and fool others about, what we're really like and what's inside, which eventually leads to this very desperate situation of fooling ourselves. We become fooled by our own masks, and the light goes out in that connection with our true spirit, our true authentic nature. Why does this happen? You want a spiritual awakening, and next thing you know, the lights go out. Well, as we were talking about before, these sorts of breakdowns are really opening the door for a breakthrough so that something else can come in. So something else can come in because you're not complete. You're not a finished product. There needs to be the elements brought in to feed the seed so the seed can grow into fullness and become all that it is. So what is this? What is this that wants to come in when there's this breaking open? It's the archetypes. It's the archetypes. It's the things of the collective unconscious, as Jung said. The archetypes that are parts of our personality that want to land in us. They want to become involved in us, become integrated in us, and help us to evolve. There's many different archetypes. I work with men's circles and we talk about the king archetype, the warrior archetype, the magician archetype, the lover archetype. These are all things that want to come in to take us out of the little shoebox personality that we've arrived at age 20 so that we can go beyond the parental envelope of things and build ourselves using these archetypes. Otherwise, we risk really staying stuck in the archetype of the child. The archetype of the child, which Jung referred to this complex as the pure aeternus. That's Latin for the eternal child. That we risk being stuck in a childlike state for our entire life unless we build ourselves through these other archetypes. And this is really ubiquitous in our society. As Robert Bly points out in his book called The Sibling Society, he says we've got a society of siblings. We've got a society of children that have not grown up, that they're just a bunch of complaining, self-entitled children that aren't growing up. They're not building themselves. They're stuck in the envelope of childhood. So these things want to break through. They want to break through, which is what causes these breakdowns in the psyche. Whether we're ready, willing, and able or not, the force of the psyche is going to say, I am going to have my way. And it's going to break through. And it may appear like we're losing our personality, but we're really being given an invitation to develop our personality. And this involves, well, I'm going to read a little piece here from Spiritual Emergency. From the chapter by John Perry. And he talks about, I am continually puzzled by the extreme turbulence that accompanies profound change in the psyche. When a true spiritual awakening and transformation is underway, one encounters images of death and the destruction of the world itself. The psyche does not express itself gently, but one would like to think that this movement of the spirit would come about in a more orderly manner through exposure to workshops, exercises, and other instructional techniques. The hope of those of us in the field of psychotherapy is that such techniques might bring about change in a more gentle fashion. But as Jung has observed, there are often periods of very uncomfortable deadaptation and episodes of altered states of consciousness called transitory psychosis. So, yeah, transitory psychosis is part and parcel with the journey from A to B. It's got to be this divine madness given as a gift that disturbs things. Hopefully it can be supported more gently with proper techniques and modalities and understanding. But as the book states, there's often images of death and destruction, which is part and parcel of growth. There has to be some death and destruction of the old in order for the new to come forth. But what's problematic is sometimes people misinterpret this impulse of death, not realizing that there's different levels to death, and death doesn't necessarily mean physical death. But if you interpret as physical death, as some people do, it can lead to suicide. That they feel the only way that they're going to make it, their next step forward needs to be suicide. But it's interesting, this word suicide, sui, in the Latin means self. And side means to kill. So suicide is really to kill the self, which is exactly what the impulse is directing us to do in order to be able to go from one state of being into another. There has to be a death to the self so that the higher self can come in and abide within the realm of the personality. But when we misinterpret that, or we don't support people to understand this process, that we're here to go from being a caterpillar to a butterfly, then we can be hoodwinked, we can be hijacked by forces that do want us to end our lives prematurely and not take advantage of the divine gift. So I do want to read a little bit from Rudolf Steiner's book, How to Know the Higher Worlds, because the subject of this talk is to look at this through the framework of modern initiation. That when we understand modern initiation, we can understand what's going on. And I'm going to read from chapter 9 of How to Know What Higher Worlds, which is titled The Splitting of the Personality. The splitting of the personality in esoteric training. The splitting of the personality in esoteric training. That part of esoteric training is to split the personality. So I'm really hope you will hang in here, because I'm going to read quite a bit. I don't think too many people make it to chapter 9 in Steiner's How to Know the Higher Worlds, but it's really important information. So here we go. The higher life remains unconscious in most human beings. But as esoteric students, we bring these higher activities into consciousness. Thereby, our lives are utterly changed. As long as our souls could not see in the higher sense, they are guided by superior cosmic beings. Now they have outgrown this guidance. Just as the operation that enables blind persons to see can change their lives so that they no longer need to be guided by others, so esoteric training likewise changes our lives. As esoteric students, we outgrow the need to be led. From now on, we must lead ourselves. As soon as this happens, of course, we become liable to errors, of which ordinary consciousness can have no inkling. We now act out of the world from which, unknown to us before, higher powers once influenced us. These higher powers are regulated by the universal harmony of the cosmos. On the path of inner training, however, we move out of this cosmic harmony. We must now do by ourselves what was previously done for us without our help or participation. For this reason, esoteric writings often have much to say of the dangers connected with the ascent to higher worlds. These descriptive warnings may easily instill a fear of the higher life in timid souls, yet it must be said that such dangers exist only if we fail to follow the necessary precautions. As long as we follow fully the advice given by true esoteric training, our ascent to higher worlds will endanger neither life nor limb, even though it will take us through experiences whose power and greatness exceed anything that our wildest sense-bound imagination could conceive of. We encounter terrible powers that threaten life at every turn. We likewise learn to use certain forces and beings imperceptible to our physical senses. The great temptation will be to use these forces for our own selfish, forbidden ends, or to use them incorrectly out of an inadequate knowledge of the higher worlds. Some of these significant experiences, such as the encounter with the guardian of the threshold, will be discussed in later chapters. Nevertheless, whether we are aware of them or not, we must realize that forces hostile to life exist. True, the relationship to us is determined by higher powers, but this relationship naturally changes when we consciously enter into the world previously hidden from us. At the same time, however, our own being is enhanced and our horizon of life experiences is expanded tremendously. Real danger exists, however, only when impatience and arrogance lead us to assume a certain premature autonomy in regard to our experiences in the higher worlds, when we cannot wait for sufficient insight into the supersensible laws to be given to us. Clearly, in this domain, humility and modesty are far less empty words than they are in ordinary life. But if these qualities have become second nature to us in the best sense, then we can be certain that our ascent to a higher life will be without danger to what we call our life and health. Above all, we must avoid any disharmony between our higher experiences and the events and demands of our everyday life. Our work is wholly here on earth. Our work is wholly here on earth. And if we evade our earthly tasks and try to escape into another world, we can rest assured that we will never achieve our goal. Yet what our senses perceive is only part of this world. The beings who express themselves in the facts of the physical world are spiritual beings and inhabit the spiritual world. We must achieve and be blessed by the Spirit so that we can introduce its revelations into the sense-perceptible world. In other words, we must transform the earth by implanting in it what we discover in the spiritual realm. Our task is the transformation of the earth. Therein lies the only reason for seeking higher knowledge. The earth as we know it with our senses depends on the spiritual world. And this means that we can truly work on the earth only if we share in these worlds where creative forces are concealed. This realization should be our only motivation for wanting to ascend to higher worlds. If we enter esoteric training with this attitude and never deviate from the course it charts for us, we need fear no danger. The prospect of potential dangers on the path of esoteric training should not keep us from following it. It should merely exhort us to work diligently on developing the qualities that every true student of esoteric knowledge should possess. After these introductory comments, intended to dispel any fears, we should now look more closely at some of these so-called dangers, which we'll do after we take a little break. So we were reading from this book by Rudolf Steiner, How to Know Higher Worlds. The subtitle to this book is called A Modern Path of Initiation. And he was laying out, and this is why I'm reading it, is because I don't think there's any real quick fixes to things around mental illness and psychosis and things like that, other than that we need to evolve properly. And to do that, we need to be on a modern spiritual path. And we need to understand the nature of modern spiritual self-initiation. This is really the long-term solution. So, this is a modern path of spiritual initiation.
Yeah.
Richard Rudolf Steiner, as a modern initiate, he's probably one of the greatest initiates of our age, with the work that he birthed while he was alive from the late 1800s to 1925, with a huge oeuvre of lectures that were recorded, written down, as well as numerous books to address the needs of modern consciousness, because he divided things into the old mysteries, the old mystery schools, and the new mysteries, and that human consciousness is evolving and changing and has different needs. So yeah, some of the older paths really don't have enough for us to go 100% into fullness. We're going to continue reading from this chapter 9 of How to Know the Higher Worlds, entitled The Splitting of the Personality in Esoteric Training. We're really getting into the meat of it now. The distinction between what Steiner called the old mysteries and the new mysteries was, now we really need to give birth to our own higher self as the guide of ourselves. That the supports of religion and the teachers and the gurus and the shamans and whatnot are still there, but they're diminishing. They're diminishing in their potency to be able to help us, because the spiritual world is actually stepping back, as Steiner describes it, that the higher beings that have guided our evolution to this point are actually stepping back to give us the breadth and the space to stand on our own 2 feet and to live from our higher self, our own higher guidance. Otherwise, we're not going to grow up and we're not going to be free. We're always being held and coddled spiritually and not allowed to fall and have our bumps and go mad, lose our minds, lose balance, and then have to find balance again to restore ourselves, then we're never really going to grow up and be free. So it's about shifting the locus of focus really from the being held from the outside to being able to hold ourselves, to hold our own, and to live from that higher place, which he's going to start to get into here now in this chapter 9. This whole book is really about the connection with the higher self. So just to pick up where I left off, after these introductory comments intended to dispel any fears, we shall now look more closely at some of these so-called dangers. Great changes definitely occur in the subtler ether and astral bodies of a person who undertakes esoteric training. These changes are connected with certain evolutionary processes taking place in the three fundamental forces of the soul: willing, feeling, and thinking. And he's going to repeat these three words several times here. Willing, feeling, and thinking as the three fundamental forces of our soul life. Before our training, the relationship between these is determined by higher cosmic laws. Nothing about the way we think, feel, or will is arbitrary. Every idea that becomes conscious is connected by natural laws to a particular feeling or act of will. For instance, when we enter a stuffy room, we open the window. Or when we hear our name called, we answer. Similarly, a foul smell evokes a feeling of disgust. These seemingly simple connections between thinking, feeling, and willing are the foundation upon which, if we survey it, we find that our whole life is built. This is the foundation upon which our whole life is built, the connection between thinking, feeling, and willing. We even consider the interconnectedness of these powers of thinking, feeling, and willing, based as they were on the laws of human nature, to be a prerequisite for a normal, quote, life. We would consider a person who took pleasure in foul odors, or refused to answer questions as, quote, not normal, as violating the laws of human nature. We expect a good upbringing and appropriate instructions to have results because we assume that we can connect a child's feeling, willing, and thinking in a way that corresponds to human nature. Thus, we teach children certain concepts on the assumption that these will later connect with their feelings and will. All such efforts are based on the underlying fact that the midpoints of thinking, feeling, and willing are connected in our finer subtle bodies in a definite and lawful manner. So he's just saying through the course of growing up in our upbringing, there is this connection between our thinking, feeling, and willing that leads to, quote, normal behavior. This connection in the finer organism of the soul is reflected in the coarser physical body. Here too, the connection between the organs of will and the organs of thinking and the organs of feeling is determined by laws. This is why a certain thought will regularly evoke a particular feeling or activity of will. Right? You have a thought, ice cream. Feeling goes, yeah, want to get some. And then your will grabs your wallet and you go get it. Clink, clink, clink. In the course of higher development, however, the threads connecting these three basic powers are interrupted, severed. At first, this break occurs only in the subtler soul organism, but later, as we continue our ascent to higher knowledge, the separation also extends into the physical body. In fact, as one develops spiritually, the brain actually separates into three distinct members. Admittedly, this separation is not physically perceptible in the ordinary sense organs and cannot be proven with even the finest physical instruments. Nevertheless, it occurs. Clairvoyants can see that the brain of a person possessing advanced abilities separates into three independently active entities: a thinking brain, a feeling brain, and a willing brain. At this point in our spiritual evolution, the organs of thinking, feeling, and willing function separately, quite independently of one another. Their interconnection is thus no longer regulated by their own inherent laws, but by the individual's awakened higher consciousness. They're no longer governed by the laws of nature, but now governed by their awakened higher consciousness, we hope. This is the hope. Therefore, one of the first changes we notice in ourselves as we advance in esoteric training is that neither ideas and feelings nor feelings and decisions are connected unless we ourselves create the connection between them. No impulse leads us from thought to action unless we ourselves freely create it. Consequently, we can now confront dispassionately events that before our training would have filled us with either burning love or bitter hatred. We can refrain from acting even in the presence of thoughts that would have spurred us automatically to action. Similarly, we can now act solely on the basis of pure will, even though others who have not undergone esoteric training cannot see the slightest reason for engaging in such actions. Thus, the great accomplishment bestowed upon us on this path is the attainment of complete mastery over the interaction of our thinking, feeling, and willing. But such complete mastery over our soul forces also means that we have complete and individual responsibility for them. Not until we have transformed our being in this way can we enter into a conscious relationship with certain supersensible beings and forces. For our soul forces of thinking, feeling, and willing are related to specific fundamental forces in the universe. For example, the force inherent in our will can affect certain things and beings of the higher world. It can also perceive them, but it can also do so only once it has become free from its connection to feeling and thinking in our soul. As soon as this connection is undone, the activity of the will can be directed outward. The same is true of the powers of thinking and feeling. They're now free to be directed outward. If someone sends a feeling of hatred toward me, a clairvoyant can see this as a delicate cloud of light of a certain hue and can ward off this hatred just as we would ward off a physical blow that is aimed at us. So these forces of the soul can now become active psychically because they're liberated from the threads that united them. Those threads have been severed so that they can come under the governance of the higher self. Hatred then becomes a perceptible phenomenon in the supersensible world, but we can see it only when we are able to direct the force inherent in our feeling outward, much as we direct the receptivity of our eyes outward into the sense world. And not only hatred, of course, other more significant facts of the material world are also perceptible in the higher world. And one can enter into a conscious relationship with these by discovering and liberating the basic forces of the soul. Unless we follow the instructions of esoteric science closely, such a separation of thinking, feeling, and willing can easily lead us to deviate from the proper human path of development in 3 ways. Such a deviation occurs when the links connecting the 3 forces of the soul are destroyed before higher consciousness and its understanding are sufficiently advanced to be able to take the reins and lead the now separated forces in the right way to a free, harmonious working together. The achievement of higher consciousness is necessary because, as a rule, the 3 forces do not develop equally in every phase of a person's life. In one person, thinking may be more developed than feeling and willing. In one person, thinking may be more developed than feeling and willing, while in another, feeling or willing may be predominant. As long as the connection between thinking, feeling, and willing remains regulated by the higher laws of the cosmos, however, such developmental discrepancies do not cause any disturbing irregularities in the higher sense. Now he goes on to explain what these irregularities might look like. If will predominates in a person, for example, then the cosmic laws ensure that other forces counterbalance it and keep it from becoming excessive. But once we begin esoteric training, then the regulating influence of feeling and thinking on the will ceases, and the will, now no longer held in check, constantly impels us on to tremendous performances of power. If we reach this point before we have mastered higher consciousness and are able to create harmony between our forces, then our will can run rampant. It can overwhelm us so that our feeling and thinking sink into complete powerlessness, and we become slaves, scourged by our will. As a result, we can become violent in character, rushing from one unbridled action to the next. We can also go astray if our feeling frees itself from the restraint of higher cosmic laws. A person inclined to revere others, for instance, can then become so completely dependent on them that he or she loses the will and ability to think. Instead of higher knowledge, such a person's lot is the most pitiful inner emptiness and impotence. If the natural tendency of our feelings is towards piety and religious exaltation, on the other hand, we can fall into raptures of religious self-gratification. A third evil arises when thinking predominates. This produces a contemplative nature, but one that is closed in upon itself and hostile to life. For a person of such a nature, the world has meaning only insofar as it provides objects to satisfy a boundless desire for knowledge. Thoughts no longer stir such a person to action or feelings. Instead, such people become indifferent and cold, avoiding contact with ordinary things as if they were nauseating, or at least had lost all meaning. Thus, there are 3 ways in which we can go astray and deviate from the proper path of esoteric training. We can fall into willful violence, into sentimental luxuriating in feelings, or into a cold, loveless striving for knowledge. Viewed from the outside by materialistic psychiatry, for instance, people who go astray in these ways do not seem very different, certainly not in degree, from those who are insane, or at least extremely neurotic. Naturally, esoteric training should not lead to such a condition. The important thing is to ensure that thinking, feeling, and willing, the 3 fundamental forces of the soul, have developed harmoniously before they are freed from the connection implanted in them and become subject to the awakened higher consciousness. If any mistake is made in this development, and one of these three basic human forces loses its restraint, then the higher self's birth into existence will be a miscarriage. When this happens, unrestrained force completely floods our whole personality, and it will be a long time before balance can begin to be restored. Thus, what seems a harmless aspect of our character before we enter esoteric training, such as whether we are predominantly thinking, feeling, or willing types, is so intensified once we become students that it can overpower the universal human element so necessary for life. This only becomes a real danger, however, once we are able to have conscious higher experiences in sleep consciousness as well in the waking state. As long as our experience of sleep remains at the level of the mere awareness of the intervals in it, our sensory life, regulated by universal cosmic laws, has a compensatory effect on our soul when we are awake, restoring the soul's balance. Here it is critically important that our waking life be normal and healthy in all respects. The more fully we can respond to the demands that the outer world places on a healthy, vigorous constitution of body, soul, and spirit, the better. On the other hand, an overtly exciting or exhausting daily life can be harmful because we then add potentially destructive and hindering influences to the great transformations taking place in our inner life. We should deliberately seek out situations for which our strength is adequate and that can bring peace and harmony into our relationship with our surroundings. And we should avoid everything that might disturb this harmony and bring anxiety and turmoil into our lives. Here it is not so much a matter of getting rid of anxiety and turmoil in an outer sense as it is of taking care that our moods, intentions, and thoughts, as well as our physical health, remain stable and do not constantly fluctuate. All this is not as easy for us after we have begun esoteric training as it was before. The higher experiences that now play into our lives continuously affect our whole existence. If anything is out of order in these higher experiences, then this irregularity lies in wait everywhere and can potentially throw us off at every turn. Therefore, we must do all we can to ensure complete self-mastery. We should never lack presence of mind or fail to survey calmly all situations under our consideration. In fact, any true esoteric schooling itself develops all these qualities in us. In the course of such training, we learn of the dangers and at the same time discover all the power we need to eliminate them from the field. That's chapter 9 of How to Know the Higher Worlds by Rudolf Steiner, called The Splitting of the Personality in Esoteric Training. And thank you for listening to all this reading, but I felt it was worthwhile to have it all put out there, have it all recorded on the video for people to hear, because I believe what he's talking about here and the perspective he's giving of the severing of the connections between thinking, feeling, and will, setting them free so they can be under the auspices of the higher self is an important perspective, because this is what is happening to people that are losing control of their minds, losing control of their souls. Because if we're not lifting ourselves up to higher heights, then we risk falling into the deeper depths, and, as he says, having a spiritual miscarriage. A spiritual miscarriage, which is exactly what happened to me at my early 20s, where I started to put myself through spiritual awakening and training, but not really being guided or knowing what I was doing. And so I fell into the three dangers of thinking that was out of control, feelings that were out of control, and a will that was out of control. And as he says, it takes a while to reestablish balance, and it took several years to get a handle on myself again, to get out of the prison of my parents' basement and to begin to function like a healthy, normal human being once again. And it really was a breakthrough in my life. It really was a blessing in some ways to go through that, and it has brought me to this place here where I can speak about it, and in fact, writing a book about it. My book, Secrets of the Yellow Brick Road, with subtitle A Map for the Modern Spiritual Journey, looks at the Wizard of Oz as a modern-day fairy tale that depicts exactly what Rudolf Steiner is talking about in the development of our being, from, being stuck on the farm in Kansas,
Black and white.
with black and white in Kansas with Annie M, Uncle Henry, heading towards the death and potentially taking Dorothy with her. But then she goes into her inner life in Oz, and there begins to work with the parts of herself. She meets the Scarecrow, who's looking for his thinking, right? Wants a brain. Discovers the Tin Man, who's looking for heart, right? That's Dorothy's feeling life. And the Lion, who's looking for courage or the will. And so that shows that in this picture, in this modern fairy tale, exactly what we need to be doing with the Dorothy in us to take mastery of these three parts. At first, they were inept. They couldn't really do anything. The Scarecrow couldn't think, and the Tin Man couldn't feel, and the Cowardly Lion had no courage. But in the end, they were the ones that began to serve her when she was taken captive by the Wicked Witch of the West. Dorothy was stuck in her parents' basement in the witch's castle, and then the Tin Man, Lion, and Scarecrow began working. But there's a very interesting scene in the movie, in the poppy field, where the Wicked Witch of the West puts them under the spell, this illusion of poppies, right? Poppies. And what happens? Well, the Scarecrow falls apart. He gets hysterical. He gets manic. He starts jumping up and down. We got this manic Scarecrow. And then we have the Tin Man. He just starts weeping uncontrollably, just, emoting. And then the Will goes unconscious and is incapable to do anything. He's just not there. And fortunately, the higher self, Glinda, the Good Witch, is able to make it snow, wave her wand, makes it snow, counters the spell, and allows them to pick themselves up and continue on the Yellow Brick Road.
Yeah.
So that's basically what this book is doing. It dissects the whole story from Kansas into Oz and back to Kansas again. Well, should I wrap this down here? As I said, there's going to be a part 2 in April. But I think it's, really wonderful to show that there's hope if a person wants to take up a modern esoteric schooling for themselves. Like, this is what the call is to get on that new platform of training, and that there's safety in that. I'm just going to read the last paragraph from one of Rudolf Steiner's other books called Theosophy, which we're also studying in the spiritual boot camp training, from this last chapter that's called The Path of Knowledge, where he says, those who investigate existence in the spirit can indeed achieve the soul distance from sensory reality necessary for their research, without becoming strangers to the world on a general level. Isn't that great? We can do this esoteric research and training without becoming strangers to this world. On the other hand, we must also realize that knowledge of the spiritual world that is acquired either through actually setting out on this path or through simply grasping spiritual scientific truths with our unprejudiced and healthy common sense does lead to higher moral standards, to an understanding of sensory existence as it accords with the truth, to a secure confidence in life, and to mental health. I thought that was a great last sentence in this book. From St. Paul in his epistle to Timothy, where he says, "For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." The Spirit of God within us, the divine nature, is not a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind, sound thinking, sound perception. Amen?
Amen.
Amen.
Aho.
Oh.